All living beings mean creatures caught in the limits of time and space. No matter how brilliant a person is, in front of the barriers of time and space, one will ultimately become a tiny existence. Therefore, practice for spiritual enlightenment is solely about solving the problems of time and space. So, how do we solve the problems of time and space? Let's take a look at the question of space first. In terms of space, our existence becomes infinitely small like dust. Compared to the universe, it's so insignificant that we even feel a deep sense of shame. So first you need to increase the size. In order to do that, you have no choice but to unconditionally connect. Through resonance with the outside world, you gradually expand from the individual consciousness to the whole consciousness. However, the whole consciousness is not so easily obtained. If desire works a little bit, you will return to the individual consciousness again and become like dust. So, you have to control the desire. And to do that, you have to start with the ego, the root of the desire. Ego refers to the idea that the individual I is real. Since the I is real, the desire moves and the individual is caught in the limit of the ego. In any case, it is a spatial practice to acquire whole consciousness through connection. In the end, this spatial practice focuses on cultivating the mind. You have to keep cultivating your mind to obtain whole consciousness, but in reality, it is difficult to become fully reflective like a transparent mirror. If there is no dust in the mind, there will be nirvana. It is the state of nirvana in which the entity called I ceases to exist, and there is no obstacle in the mind. The state of this consciousness is called whole consciousness or pure consciousness, and the problem of space seems to have been solved to some extent. But the question of time still remains. The question of time is finding the beginning and end of existence. In other words, we need to realize the first cause of all existences to find the answer, but spiritual liberation, or nirvana, is not enough. So, what about temporal practice? It was Siddhartha who first introduced the temporal practice method. At that time, the practice of Brahmanism was focused on space, and thus nirvana and spiritual liberation were pursued. In contrast, Siddhartha aimed solely at solving the question of time. Because his reason for renunciation came from the question of time. As you know, Siddhartha realized the limit of time while watching the death of an old man and decided to leave home to solve the question of time that causes life and death. For this reason, Siddhartha was not satisfied with solving the question of space, called liberation and nirvana pursued by Brahmanism. Because the question of first cause is still not solved. At that time, there was no teacher who taught temporal practice, so Siddhartha came to the practice alone. In spatial practice, the mind becomes the object of your spiritual practice. You have to purify your mind and restore the whole consciousness. However, in temporal practice, the focus is on thinking rather than mind. This does not mean getting rid of or cutting off thoughts, but rather means developing them to the highest level. Simply put, it is about solving the question of the first cause by using your thoughts well. Therefore, we should not stop or cut off thoughts as in spatial practice. We should solve the question of the first cause by constantly generating thoughts, nurturing wisdom, and furthermore, promoting enlightenment. In the end, Siddhartha sat under the Bodhi tree and used his thoughts as a weapon to fight against the question of time. And finally, by realizing the first cause, he conquered time. Since the first causes before time and space are divided, the problem of space is also solved. Siddhartha overcame the limits of time and space and became the first human being to attain Buddhahood. In summary, spiritual practice is divided into spatial practice to cultivate the mind, and temporal practice to cultivate thoughts. The former is suitable for the spiritually low-grade people, and the latter is suitable for the spiritually high-grade people. If so, it will be simple if everyone chooses to perform temporal practice. Unfortunately, however, it is structurally difficult to perform temporal practice, for it is programmed to easily forget the question of time when you recall time. For the survival of the fittest, it is set so that no one vividly realizes the fact that any living thing ultimately dies. In other words, time is erased for space. For this reason, humans can't let go of their greed even before they die, causing all sorts of friction. Furthermore, if you dig into the source of time, you will even be disturbed by the dimension. Therefore, it is very difficult to make the question of time the topic of one's spiritual practice, except for spiritually high-grade people. This is the reason why almost all monks and yogis, whether Buddhist or Hindu, regard cultivating the mind as a major part of their spiritual practice. Considering this, in order for mankind to grow spiritually, we have no choice but to rely on scholars. This is because scholars have consistently developed only thoughts, excluding subjectivity such as the mind. This is the reality that scholars have some reason to perform temporal practice, but monks and yogis don't. It is because they believe that if we let go of our mind, the spiritual practice will be over. It is necessary to keep in mind once again that spiritual enlightenment is the world of thoroughly objective truth. Can you overcome the biological forgetting function and make the question of time the topic of your spiritual practice? If it is possible, you will obtain spiritual enlightenment sooner or later. What is time for you?